Good evening and welcome everyone. We've been pursuing tonight's speakers for some time. It started from almost the first minute we came upon this sort of less mainstream but imaginative and interesting subject. Despite the ravages and interruptions stemming from COVID, I'm delighted that this has eventually come to fruition. And tonight we've got two speakers for the price of one, with each bringing their own particular skill sets to enhance our enjoyment of the evening. We have Graham Holton, who has a background as a professional librarian with a lifelong interest in family history. He's been a tutor on the University of Strathclyde's postgraduate programme in genealogical studies since it commenced in 2007. Graham is the author of the second edition of Discover Your Scottish Ancestry and also leads the Battle of Bannockburn and the Declaration of Arbroath Family History projects. These groups focus on tracing early descendants using documentary and genetic evidence. He is also the editor of the 2019 publication Tracing Your Ancestors Using DNA. We also have Alasdair Macdonald. Alasdair is a teaching fellow in genealogical studies, again at the University of Strathclyde, with research interests focusing on the use of DNA in genealogical research. He is currently researching the origin and linkage of male lineages in the British Isles. He also specialises in the history and genealogy of Scottish clans. Alasdair is a volunteer administrator for a number of projects, including the Scottish DNA Project, the Flemish and Scotland DNA Project, and is also a contributor to the Tracing Your Ancestors Using DNA publication. There's an often used phrase, but tonight it fits the bill exactly. And that phrase is that we could not have found better speakers to deliver this talk. That statement is unquestionable. So I'll give you Graham Holton and Alasdair Macdonald. Over to you guys.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to get the screen up.
Yep.
Okay, so our presentation this evening aims to tell you something about our Declaration of Arbroath Family History project and report on some of our findings. Several articles have appeared about the project, one of which Neil referred to, as well as a report, and hopefully we'll present our planned project exhibition, which had to be postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic at some point next year. The Declaration of Arbroath was in fact a letter to the Pope, John the 22nd, requesting his assistance to encourage Edward II of England to recognise Scotland as an independent nation and to reach a peace agreement. It was sent on behalf of nobles, barons, freeholders and the community of the realm of Scotland, with 39 of these individuals being named in the document, to which were attached an impressive display of seals. You can see a selection of these here, of which now only 19 survive, including 9 for individuals not specifically named in the document. For ease of reference, we will refer to these individuals as signatories. Although the document was issued at Arbroath Abbey, where Bernard, Chancellor of Scotland, was abbot, and dated 6th of April 1320, it was actually discussed and planned at a royal council which met at Newbattle Abbey in March 1320 and was dispatched in May. It's interesting to note that acceptance of Robert Bruce as king was not universal. At the Black Parliament, held in August 1320 at Scone, 12 individuals were accused of conspiring to kill King Robert. Known as the Soulis Conspiracy after William Soulis, Lord of Liddesdale and Butler of Scotland, the alleged conspirators included 5 promoters of the Declaration of Arbroath. 5 of the conspirators were found not guilty, 4 were executed, 2 were sentenced to life imprisonment, and 1 died before his trial. This further secured King Robert's control, but as far as the recognition and peace sought by the Declaration were concerned, these were still some time off, finally being achieved by the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton of 1328. So what is our Declaration of Arbroath Family History project all about? You can see from this slide the answers to the questions: what is the project, why was it set up, and how is it carried out? And we'll explain a little more about the 2 strands, but it might be helpful to know that the documentary research was carried out by students and the genetic genealogy research mainly by staff, with some input from students. I should also explain that genetic genealogy involves the use of DNA testing as an aid to genealogical research. Medieval genealogy tends to be a rather specialist area, so the project provides a focus for a learning opportunity for students in this field. It also links in well with the use of Y-DNA testing to trace early descents, as you will see later. We're going to give you an overview of the methodologies used in the project before looking at 4 of the families in some detail. The students' work on the documentary strand of the project involved 3 tasks for 2 of the signatories: the writing of brief biographies, the creation of 4-generation family trees beginning with the grandparents of the signatories and tracing their known descendants for 4 generations, and finally providing details of their coats of arms. To carry out these tasks, the students were expected to use mainly secondary sources, with the possibility of consulting some printed versions of primary sources. This slide gives a list of the main secondary sources used, as well as 2 sources which include information from primary sources: the People of Medieval Scotland, or POMS website, and Macdonald's Scottish Armorial Seals. As a result of student work, we now have research results for the 48 signatories, forming a major resource, a foundation for further research. Just to take 3 examples from this list. Firstly, here's the homepage of Medieval Lands. This site is reasonably authoritative and is referenced to many primary sources. POMS, or People of Medieval Scotland, makes use of original documents, including many charters, to create a database of people recorded in Scotland between 1093 and 1371. And the third example is Macdonald's Scottish Armorial Seals, which provides descriptions of a large number of seals, including examples from the Declaration, such as this Dunbar seal. Combined with information from other sources on the colouring of the coats of arms, it is possible to recreate coloured versions of the signatories' arms, as you see here.
Genetic genealogy combines traditional genealogical research with genetics. Research into the signatories, who are all men, use one type of DNA, the Y chromosome. The inheritance path of the Y chromosome and the inheritance of a surname work together in this type of research. While men and women carry the same number of genes and have the same number of chromosomes, 23 pairs, there is one significant difference. The 23rd pair, known as the sex chromosomes, are different between males and females. While females have 2 chromosomes, one inherited from each parent, men have one X chromosome inherited from their mother, and a Y chromosome always inherited from their father. The Y chromosome they inherit is an almost exact copy of their father's Y chromosome. However, small random copy errors in the DNA code can occur. These errors are what are used when comparing the genetic code between different individuals. We will come back to copy errors again soon. As elsewhere in Western Europe, Scotland has its own unique range of surnames. Each has its own rich and varied history. Fixed surnames in Scotland were adopted over a period of 300 to 500 years, from around 1100 AD. Before fixed surnames, individuals typically had a second name to mark them out in their community, perhaps associated with the location where they lived or came from, or because of a physical or character feature. The name might have been patronymic, meaning the individual was named after their father, or after an occupation, or some other byname meaning a nickname. Over time, and as property and inheritance began to be written down in documents, particularly due to the influence of feudalism introduced from the continent, there was a need for an individual to be known by a fixed identity, hence the formation of fixed family surnames. In Scotland, and in particular the Highlands and Islands, Galloway and parts of the Scottish borders, fealty to the local landowner or chief by those of a lower social class resulted in the adoption of the surname of that feudal superior. For example, the surnames Stewart, Campbell, Fraser and Lindsay, to name but a few. This is one reason why Scotland has fewer surnames than Ireland or England. In summary, as the Y chromosome and fixed surnames follow the direct male line, linkage between individuals bearing the same surname can be established by establishing and comparing the DNA profile of their Y chromosomes. Surnames may well descend down the male line, but there are a number of issues and assumptions we need to be aware of. Firstly, many surnames have multiple origins that originate completely independently from each other in different parts of the country. For example, Mackays from Strathnaver are different from Mackays from the Rins of Islay in the Hebrides, or someone called Baxter in Morayshire is unrelated to a Baxter in Dumfries. They therefore have different male progenitors. Bearing a particular surname does not guarantee that an individual carries the Y chromosome that represents the documented or traditional male line of a particular Scottish clan or family. Surnames were adopted for a whole range of reasons. I've already mentioned fealty, but the surname may have knownly been adopted due to female inheritance when the man took on his spouse's surname to inherit property. The name may have been unknowingly adopted due to fosterage, or due to the early death of a partner and subsequent remarriage of the widow or widower, resulting in infant children adopting the surname from the first marriage. However, the elephant in the room with regard to surnames and descent is that although a child knows who his mother is, the identity of the father could be someone other than the mother's partner. Thus, illegitimacy may mean an individual bears a surname, but his Y chromosome is that from a different and unrelated lineage. To compare results, a relational database is required. Family Tree DNA in Houston, USA provide this. They also host 99.9% of surname, geographical and haplogroup projects. The Y chromosome profile of individual men are compared using two different types of tests. Both look for the number of similarities and differences between the profiles. As mentioned earlier, when DNA is copied, small errors can occur in the genetic code during the copy process. These copy errors are very normal. However, they are random events. We call these copy errors mutations. In turn, the location where a mutation occurs in the Y chromosome is given an alphanumeric identification code. In genetic genealogy, we typically refer to mutations as markers. The introductory test for surname research is called a short tandem repeat, STR for short. It tests either 37 or 111 markers, basically locations to identify if mutations have occurred. These markers measure the value of very short sequences of DNA that are repeated a number of times, for example 8 or 10 or 16 times. These values can mutate over time to a new value, for example 8 to 9. They can also backmutate. These features are helpful for establishing relatedness. In the example in this image, the first marker, called DYS393, has a value repeated 13 times in the test result of each participant. These values can mutate over time to a new value. For example, the top individual has a value of 10 at DYS391, while the 6 other men have a value of 11. Genetic distance is used to establish relatedness. As a rule of thumb, when comparing results, the fewer differences, the closer the relationship. The more differences, the more distant the relationship. If you're not related to another test taker within a historical time frame, around the last 1,000 years, you won't match them closely or at all. This image shows a test taker's closest matches at the 111 marker STR level. Genetic distance, the number of differences or mutations that occur between the test taker and others, can be seen at the left-hand column. His closest matches shared 4 differences over 111 markers. STR tests, though, have limitations. As already mentioned, markers can over time backmutate to their original value, or more often mutate to the same value in parallel, even though 2 lines are not directly or recently connected. If one or other of these events occur at multiple locations, it can make 2 test takers look much more closely related than they really are. We call this convergence. Because STRs have limitations, we use a second type of test that takes a different approach. It sequences the DNA sample to identify a different type of mutation. This second type of test identifies variants at single locations on the Y chromosome that mutate very, very slowly. Each mutation is called a SNP, which is short for single nucleotide polymorphism. These markers are sequenced and offered in a range of products, from testing of a single SNP to testing 15 million locations or more on the Y chromosome. The latter help us discover mutations that can become family or lineage markers. One product for this type of test is that offered by Family Tree DNA in Houston in the States. It's called the Big Y 700. An advantage of FTDNA is the size of the Y-DNA database, the largest by far in the world. Variants, the mutational differences, can be either shared or private. The value for each variant is recorded and compared with others in the database. If more than one individual has the variant value, it can become a SNP marker and given a name. In this example, variant ZP169 has mutated from a value of G to a value of A. This marker defines a branch of the Dunbar family. Candidates with documented male line descents from signatories of the Declaration were identified using traditional genealogical research techniques. Often the individual was from a noble family or from a notable cadet line. We always started with the introductory STR test to check that the test taker matched who we expected them to match. Sometimes his 37 marker matching was inconclusive. Therefore, it was upgraded to 67 markers. Occasionally, the test can show that an individual has experienced somewhere in his pedigree a break in the Y chromosome due to illegitimacy or some other unknown paternity event. The methodology involves evaluation, analysis, and corroboration. After evaluation and analysis of the initial test result, the kit or kits are upgraded to test SNPs using the Big Y 700 test. This was done so that specific SNP markers could be identified. Firstly, to identify the SNP branch marker for the lineage. Secondly, to calculate the date of formation of that branch of the family. And thirdly, to corroborate matching with other test takers who do not have a documented descent. We also worked in partnership with a number of surname projects hosted at Family Tree DNA. Close matches to our documented descent were invited to join our closed Strathclyde research project hosted at Family Tree DNA. From the STR and SNP results, a genetic tree could be constructed that revealed branching in each lineage. This tree could then be compared and overlaid with the known genealogical tree for the lineage. For some reason or other, Sir Robert Boyd of Nodsdale was not a signatory of the Declaration of Arbroath, but he had remained a faithful supporter of Robert the Bruce throughout his reign. He was a minor landowner in Ayrshire, holding some minor official positions during English overlordship, but seems to have cast his lot in with Bruce later than 1305. He was involved in many of the exploits of the king's followers as they sought to establish Bruce as king of an independent Scots nation. In 1306, he seized control of the Rothesay Castle from the English, and later in the year was one of the group of knights who accompanied the Queen, Bruce's daughter Marjorie, and other women's folk as they fled northwards to Kildrummie Castle in Aberdeenshire. As one of Bruce's close companions who sought refuge on Rathlin Island, off the coast of Ireland, Boyd with James Douglas led an expedition to Kintyre and then to Arran as Bute prepared to return to the Scottish mainland, which he soon did, and with a raid on Turnberry. He was also involved in a campaign in Galloway led by Edward Bruce in 1308. As the king began to secure his position, he held his first parliament at St Andrews around 1308 or 1309, at which Robert Boyd was present. As a result of his loyal service, Boyd became one of the most powerful lords in the southwest of Scotland, with grants of land in Dumfriesshire and Kirkcudbrightshire, as well as in the Ayrshire districts of Kyle and Cunningham, including Kilmarnock, which became the centre of the Boyd influence. He fought in the Scots army at the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333 and may have been captured, dying shortly after. The Boyd family are a good example of how a family surname can change in order to transfer titles and property through a female heiress. The early origins of the noble family of Boyd are uncertain, and claims have been made that they were descended from Simon, brother of Walter Fitzalan, but it is likely that this Simon was a half-brother of Walter. DNA test results confirm that the Boyds are not from the same male line as the Stuarts. It is also doubtful whether this Simon had any connection with Scotland, so the early origins of the family remain unknown. The earliest documented Boyd appears to be Robert, a witness to a contract in 1205 relating to Irvine in Ayrshire. The Boyd family can be folded into the Arbroath Family History Research Project via the ancestry of participant Timothy Boyd, son of the present chief of the name, Gilbert Boyd, 6th Baron Kilmarnock. The present chiefly Boyd line are direct descendants of Gilbert Hay, Constable of Scotland, who was a signatory of the Declaration. William Boyd, 4th Earl of Kilmarnock, married in 1724 to Anne Livingston, daughter of James Livingston, 5th Earl of Linlithgow and Margaret Hay, heiress of John Hay, the 12th Earl of Earl, last of the line. William Boyd, 4th Earl of Kilmarnock, and Anne Livingston had a son called James Boyd. He changed his name to Hay on succeeding as 15th Earl of Earl and 16th Lord Hay in 1758. However, there was yet another name change back to Boyd by the present chief Gilbert in 1941. This arose due to the death of the 22nd Earl of Earl, Jocelyn Victor Hay, in Kenya. His daughter was entitled to succeed to the earldom of Earl and the chiefship of the clan Hay, but was excluded from the barony of Kilmarnock, which could only pass to males. Consequently, Jocelyn's brother resumed the surname of Boyd and succeeded to the barony of Kilmarnock. Gilbert was the son of Nicholas Hay, Lord of Earl, and like the vast majority of the Scottish nobility, swore allegiance to Edward I of England in 1296. His lands suffered severely during the War of Independence, and as a result, in 1305, he petitioned King Edward for relief from payments due from these lands. However, in March 1306, he joined the cause of Robert the Bruce, which prompted Edward to issue orders to Aimé de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, to burn and destroy his lands. He was noted as one of the most loyal supporters of Bruce and was rewarded in November 1314 with the permanent granting of the office of Constable of Scotland to him and his heirs, who still hold the title to the present day. Bruce also made a grant of lands at Slains in Aberdeenshire to Gilbert. Here we have the 4-generation genealogical chart for the Hay family. The name of Gilbert's wife has not been recorded. However, the name of his mother and grandmother have been. His grandmother, Idona Cummin, was the daughter of William Cummin, Lord of Badenoch, whose grandson, John Cummin, 3rd Earl of Buchan, was a chief opponent of Robert the Bruce. Therefore, like many within the nobility of Scotland, Gilbert Hay was related to the Cummins who supported John Balliol, King of Scots, from 1292 to 1296. And you can see the Gilbert Hay's coat of arms here. Genetically, the Boyds are part of the R1b grouping. Our research conclusions are currently provisional due to the lack of documented male line descendants who have taken a Y-DNA test, but it's highly likely that the SNP FT102166 indicates a descent from Robert Boyd, who died round about 1333 and a prominent supporter of Robert the Bruce. Since the earlier SNP FGC 12774 is carried predominantly by men named Boyd, it was almost certainly formed after the date at which the surname Boyd was firmly established, probably in the late 12th century. The two SNPs to be formed, FT69836 and then FT102166, become increasingly likely to have been formed in Robert Boyd, who died in 1333, or one of his descendants. Although the descendants of William Boyd, 4th Earl of Kilmarnock, carry the SNP 102166 and are also descended from Gilbert Hay, named in the Declaration of Arbroath, the Y-DNA of any male line descendants of Gilbert would be distinct from the Y-DNA inherited by the Bruces, as the connection with the Hay family is through a female, Anne Livingston. Interestingly, there is also another family named Boyd with a very different genetic origin in haplogroup A, which has a more recent origin in Africa and no earlier than Roman times. We now turn to the Dunbars. Patrick Dunbar, 2nd Earl of March and 8th Earl of Dunbar, sided with the English during the War of Independence, being present with his father at the siege of Calaverick Castle in 1300. Although not directly involved in the Battle of Bannockburn, he received Edward II as he escaped from the battle and assisted him to board a ship bound for Bamborough. This seems to have been his final act in support of Edward, and he then gave his allegiance to King Robert. He was later involved as a commander in several of the Scots campaigns, including the capture of Berwick in 1318, the Battle of Dolphin in 1332, and the Battle of Culloden Hill in 1333. Following this defeat, Dunbar, as commander of Berwick Castle, surrendered the stronghold to the English and briefly lent his support to Edward Balliol, attending the Parliament in 1334. By the following year, he had renewed allegiance to the Scots and served as a commander at the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346. He died in 1369. His second wife, Agnes Randolph, daughter of Bruce's companion, Thomas Randolph, Earl of Murray, became famous as Black Agnes for her role in opposing the English forces during the siege of Dunbar Castle in 1338. It is likely that his allegiance was strongly influenced by personal circumstances. He was a cousin of William de Soulis, his mother being Marjorie Comyn, daughter of Alexander Comyn, Earl of Buchan. This may have swayed him away from support for the Bruces and towards the Comyn and Balliol camp. Probably more significant was an attempt to preserve as far as possible his estates and power base in south-east Scotland, which was naturally prone to large-scale destruction during this period. As far as the early ancestry and living descendants of the Dunbars are concerned, we will come back to this towards the end of the presentation. And we can see the arms of Patrick Dunbar here in this slide. The family of Dunbar boasts probably one of the longest British unbroken documented male line ancestries, descending from Crinan the Thane, born around the late 10th century. He has been supposed by many to be one and the same as Crinan the Abbot of Dunkeld, father of King Duncan, made famous through Shakespeare's Macbeth. The general view of scholarship is now that they are different individuals, but the fact remains that Crinan the Thane was born around the late 10th century and leaves male line descendants to this day, a fact that is supported by both documentary and DNA evidence. Genetically, the Dunbar family is also part of the R1b grouping, but a completely different branch from the Boyds. Patrick Dunbar, Earl of March, who is named in the Declaration of Arbroath, left no male descendants, but 3 baronetcies still exist, held by descendants of his brother Alexander. Holders of such inherited titles often benefit from documentary evidence of their descent. 2 of the baronets have taken DNA tests, and research shows that SNP FT29439 is carried by descendants of the cadet line founded by David Dunbar of Durras, who was born around 1460. And that individual can be seen in the centre of this chart, the very centre. Since it is not currently known in which generation the SNP was formed, some of his descendants may not carry the SNP. There are a number of other more recent SNPs which have been identified, 3 of which are indicated on the accompanying chart. At least 10 non-undocumented descendants of Alexander Dunbar have been identified in the UK and North America, including Martin Dunbar, a consultant clinical psychologist from Glasgow. And he can be seen at the bottom of this chart.
Okay, we now move on to the Seton family. The Seton family was based in the Lothians, and it is thought that the Alexander named in the declaration may have been the son and heir of his father Alexander. The name appears towards the end of the list contained in the declaration, which suggests a lower status. He may have been representing his father, who was unable for some reason to be present. It is the father who is best remembered for what may have been a vital role which he played in connection with the Battle of Bannockburn. In 1308, he had entered into a bond with two other supporters of Bruce to defend Robert and the realm of Scotland. But despite this, from around 1310, he proceeded to give his support to the English, up until the eve of the battle. At that point, Alexander, seeing the low morale of the English army, defected to the Scots. He relayed his inside information about the morale of the English to King Robert the Bruce, and urged him to proceed with his plans to fight a pitched battle against the numerically vastly superior English force. The resulting victory clearly confirmed Seton's assessment of the situation. He gained the confidence of the king, becoming steward of the king's household in 1317, and being one of the Scots negotiating truces between 1317 and 1320. He must have had some involvement in the Irish campaigns of the Bruces, since he was rewarded by the king for his service in both Scotland and Ireland by a substantial grant of lands in East Lothian. By 1328, he had been appointed governor of Berwick, and shortly after became steward to the infant David, son of the king. Two of his sons, including Alexander, the possible signatory of the declaration, were killed fighting the English, and during the siege of Berwick in 1333, another son was hanged on the orders of King Edward III of England in full view of the town. As Edward Balliol, with English support, gained the upper hand in Scotland for a short time, Seton attended his parliament in 1334, but quickly reverted to supporting King David II as the tide turned again. He died around 1348. Here we have the four-generation genealogical chart for the family, and, as is often the case, the names of the wives of a number of the individuals have not been recorded. It was from Alexander, killed in 1332, that the line of the Setons continued. And here is the coat of arms of Alexander Seton. It has been suggested that the ancestry of the Seton family was originally Flemish. However, it is certain that the family settled in Lothian, with Alexander de Seton holding land there in the middle of the 12th century, probably granted to him by King David I. Genetically, the Seton family is part of the R1b grouping. Alexander Seton, son of the Alexander who had become a firm supporter of King Robert Bruce, left no sons, but his daughter Margaret married Alan de Winton, who was very likely a Seton by descent. From them, there are many male line descendants living today. Due to changes of surname connected with inheritance, there is some complexity in the lines of descent, which in some ways assists genetic genealogy research into these lines. As you can see, some descendants took on the surname Gordon. All Setons, and the Gordons who are genetically Setons but took on the surname of Gordon, carry the SNP FGC 15048. However, some Gordons also carry the SNP FT211058, while others do not. The conclusion based on current evidence is that FT211058 indicates descent from the Gordon descendants of Alexander Seton, 1st Earl of Huntly, died 1470, although, as indicated on the chart, not all of them will carry it. Interestingly, there is now a reasonable body of evidence supporting previous claims of descents probably through an illegitimate child from George Seton, fifth and last of the Seton Earls of Winton, died around 1749. Autosomal DNA testing shows DNA matching between a Seton and the mother of Philip Stead, a postgraduate student on the University of Strathclyde's Genealogical Studies course, who has documentary evidence of her descent. And now moving on to the Stuarts. Walter Stewart, 6th High Steward of Scotland, was the son of James Stewart, 5th High Steward of Scotland, and Egudea de Burgh. His father, James Stewart, was a supporter of Robert Bruce, the competitor, in his claim for the throne in 1291. A young Walter Stewart took part in the Battle of Bannockburn, where he led one of the 4 Scottish brigades. His cousin, Sir James Douglas, also fought with him. Robert the Bruce respected Walter for his courage and commitment and rewarded him with a knighthood at the battle and the hand in marriage of his daughter, the Princess Marjorie, after their success. The marriage came to a tragic end when the 19-year-old Marjorie gave birth to the future King Robert II at the roadside after being thrown from a horse. She died soon after. Walter had proven himself at Bannockburn and soon became a trusted advisor and ally of Robert I, taking part in the regaining of Berwick-upon-Tweed in 1318 and its defence against Edward II's army in 1319. He was also one of the signatories of the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320. Walter Stewart died at Bathgate Castle in Lincolnshire in 1327. He was survived by 5 children and was the ancestor of the Stuart royal dynasty, starting with his son, King Robert II. Although this chart will be hardly readable at this size, at least it gives an impression of the complexity of the family connections which is usually found with the upper nobility in the medieval period. There were often multiple marriages and more likelihood of children surviving beyond childhood compared to families of lower status, thus resulting in greater numbers of descendants. And here in the next slide is Walter Stewart's coat of arms. The Stewart family, descended from Walter FitzAlan, died 1177, High Steward of Scotland and ancestor of the Stuart kings, originated in Brittany. Walter, a minor landholder in England, arrived in Scotland during the reign of David I, and by the early 13th century the family had adopted the surname Stewart. Genetically, the Stewart family is part of the R1b grouping. Genetic genealogy research into the family is benefiting from the large number of test takers and the participation of documented male line descendants from 3 different sons of King Robert II, who died in 1390. The first significant discovery of a distinct SNPs carried by one of the branches of the family was made in 2014, when geneticist Jim Wilson identified S781 as having been formed in Sir John Stewart of Bonkall, died 1298. This, in fact, was probably the first example of what is known as a SNP progenitor to be identified through genetic genealogy and facilitated research into descendants of Walter Stewart, who died in 1327, the 6th High Steward, who both fought in the Battle of Bannockburn and was named in the Declaration of Arbroath. We now know that his descendants carry the SNP Z38845, and since his only male line descents are through his son, King Robert II, all those who test positive for Z38845 have Robert II as an ancestor. So far, male line descendants of 3 of Robert's sons, Robert III, Robert Duke of Albany and Sir John Stewart, Sheriff of Bute, have taken Y-DNA tests. This has resulted in the discovery of a number of SNPs, including SNPs ZZ52 and FT223221, carried by descendants of Robert III. SNP BY 184394, carried by descendants of Robert Stewart, Duke of Albany, and SNP Y 14197, carried by descendants of Sir John Stewart, Sheriff of Bute. Because it is not yet known in which generation these SNPs were formed, we cannot be certain that all descendants of these individuals will test positive for the SNP. As more individuals test and the DNA coverage of tests increases, more branches of the family are being discovered. Already, at least 58 male descendants of Walter Stewart have been identified, and if known female relatives and relevant matches found through autosomal DNA testing are taken into account, this number would be very much larger. Future research is planned to continue work on the families in the project and extend research to other families and kindred groupings. This is likely to cover families of some of those disinherited due to the dominance of the Bruce family, and kindred groupings such as the descendants of the 12th century warlord Somerled, incorporating the clans MacDougall and MacDonald. Some other areas of research we hope to cover are listed on the slide. One of the important outputs from this research will involve developments in the dating of SNPs and will focus around the identification of SNP progenitors. Present-day test takers with long documented descents allow us to identify what are known as SNP progenitors, individuals who lived in the past and in whom specific markers can be shown to have been formed. How can this be done? When test results from multiple surviving lines of a family are evaluated, SNP markers can be identified that were formed when a lineage branched from different sons. A split can be identified in the Dunbar family in the 15th century. Many of the Durras Dunbars carry a SNP called FT29439, while the Consey Dunbars do not. The FT29439 marker is known to have been formed in David Dunbar of Durras, born about 1460, or one of his descendants over the next 100 years or so, while descendants of his brother, Alexander of Consey, do not carry it. The specific SNP progenitor must therefore have been either David Dunbar or one of his immediate descendants. The combination of documentary evidence and genetic evidence allow questions of family origin and familial linkage to be studied that inform our understanding of relationships in earlier generations. Such data also allows other previously unknown descendants of a documented lineage to acquire more knowledge of their genealogical connection within the family. That connection might be 200 years ago or 600 plus years ago. It is now possible to identify branch markers within a recent genealogical time frame. When such data is combined with another type of test that analyzes autosomal DNA, which is DNA inherited from both parents, many genealogical puzzles and previously unanswerable questions can be addressed. Information on different aspects of our research can be found on our genetic genealogy research pages, available on the university website. We hope you found this presentation informative and interesting, and for further information or to contact us, here are some useful links.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham and Alasdair, for that fascinating insight into DNA and how it relates to genealogy. So the folks that are listening, if you've got any questions and you want to type them in, remember you have to log in with a Gmail or any Google account, in fact. But before we turn to questions, as it happens, and this is my understanding anyway, but obviously it's quite a complex area, isn't it? So you guys had access to the DNA testing results of my son, and I'm related to a signatory, the third Earl of Sutherland, William de Moravia. He had no sons, he had no issue, and so no one could be his direct descendant. But through the DNA analysis, it seems that, well, certainly within the probability parameters, that I am a descendant of his brother, Kenneth de Moravia, the fourth Earl of Sutherland, who succeeded William. And further down the line, the fifth Earl was married to one of Robert the Bruce's daughters from his second marriage, I believe. And there was manoeuvring afoot by David II for possibly the son of the Earl, I think, to take the throne. But he died of plague in England, else there would or could have been a Sutherland line of kings rather than Stewart. That's my understanding anyway. How can a question I would have is, how can people, if anybody's interested in whether it's part of your project or just or something else, what's the best way that they can sort of find out more about this, where to get testing done, and maybe even a little bit about the kind of ethics, if you like, of sharing DNA test results with academics or with institutions, possibly across the world?
Right, I don't know who wants to take which bits of that.
I could say a couple of things. Maybe just talk about consent and privacy, confidentiality first of all. That's a very important area. And as individuals, when you decide that you want to test, there's a number of test companies that you can sign up with. And you, like if you're signing up for Facebook or anything, it's up to you how much you reveal about yourself, which is okay if you decide to do that. But DNA testing will reveal information about not just you, but your family, simply because we share DNA. So it's important to be aware of that with testing. There's different types of tests that we've mentioned tonight, the Y chromosome, but also what we call the autosomal DNA. And the autosomal is what we would see advertised on the television and magazines by companies such as Ancestry. And it's very much for cousin matching in the last 200 years. And that type of test is very popular. And you will, if you take such tests, then you tend to link it with your family tree. And that allows you to make connections with others around the world. The Y chromosome test, which we have been talking about predominantly tonight, there's only a couple of companies that do it, and Family Tree DNA is one of them, and that's where the main database is. So anybody who wants to test for fun, to explore their family history, then you would test for the Y chromosome for surnames if you're a male with that particular company. The Y chromosome, there's lots of surname projects. So you mentioned the Sutherlands. I'm a co-admin actually on the Sutherland project because I've got a number of Sutherland connections. And yeah, you tend to test with the company, and then you would join. There's dozens and dozens of projects, and they're run by project volunteers who administer them, and they are often very well informed about the genealogy, but also how to interpret the results. So by testing and then joining a project, you see your results in context, and you're also given a little bit of help of understanding as well. So I'll maybe just stop there, and maybe Graham, you got anything that you'd like to say?
I think you've covered most of it. What I might mention is that if you want to possibly become involved in any of the research that we're doing, you can find out information about which surnames we're currently researching if you go to those genetic genealogy research pages that I mentioned just at the end of the talk there. And you'll see there's a section on Scottish clans and families, and we do have a list there of the families that we're currently researching. The ones we focused on tonight, of course, are amongst those, but we are widening our scope now to a number of other families. So if you find the surname, your surname or the surname you're interested in that list, then you might want to contact us and see if you could maybe participate in some way in the work we're doing. And I would suggest that would be additional to doing what Ali suggested, which would be joining a relevant surname project, DNA surname project. Okay, I think that probably covers it.
Sorry, I was just going to say, is it the case then, Graham, that to be part of your project, somebody would already have had all the testing done?
Not necessarily. You might want to just ask for some advice from us, and we could probably, point you in certain directions if you're just starting out, and it's one of the names that we're focusing on. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there is a number of very large projects that encompass particularly surnames that are very small. So I help out on the Scottish DNA project, as you mentioned at the very beginning, and that is a project like a catch-all project. So if there's not a project running, or you can become a part of something bigger, so you buy your test, and it's just a matter of clicking a button, and you join the project, and your results are sorted and within a particular group. So there's lots of different types of project for those who are interested in origins and so forth, linking it to where lines have come from. Then there's particular projects for what we call haplogroups that can be quite useful.
And also, there's no additional cost to joining the project, by the way.
Right. Okay. I was going to say about cost. I imagine that DNA testing, that the costs are coming down, but typically, can you say what kind of costs would be involved? I presume it depends on how accurate the testing is. I imagine there's sort of different levels, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we've got these two different types of tests. So the one that for cousin matching, the Ancestry do, it's probably around about £75 or so. The sale on at Family Tree DNA just now, where it's about $50 or so, I think it is. The Y chromosome test, you're talking the introductory test is somewhere around about, it's on sale just now for about $90 or roundabout, which is for £80. But the more you spend, the more data you get, and these introductory tests will tell you so much, but you find that you tend to want to upgrade so you can weed out matches that aren't as appropriate. And the type of testing we've been illustrating for SNPs, like all these big numbers we've been reading out, these types of tests is called a big Y, and they're somewhere around the region about £400, which include lots of other STR test markers in that. But you can upgrade. You can start at the beginning on a 37, and then you can use the same sample, and the next sale you can upgrade to 111, and then when you get more engrossed, you can upgrade again to the big Y. It becomes addictive. But if you do genealogy research and you're using Scotland's people and you keep picking the wrong certificate, it can be quite expensive as well. So it swings and roundabouts a little bit.
Yeah, and I know that, as I say, I think my son did it, and I think I think it was quite expensive. I think that was probably a year or maybe even 2 years ago now. I can't quite remember, but I imagine, as I say, that the costs will come down the more people that do it, I suppose, like most things.
Yeah, I think the prices they're not going up. They're definitely quite competitive, but there's like a threshold I think the companies have got to, and it's hard to budge at the moment.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here from Val. So our first question is, how do you acquire the originating samples of DNA?
Okay. Will I take that one?
Yeah, I'll go again.
Yeah. Okay. So our research is based on really targeted testing. We look for and research well documented male line descendants with an unbroken male line, because it has to be that for the Y-DNA. And then we do testing on them. So we invite them to participate in the project, and we get them to take a test if necessary. That gets upgraded to a higher level and so on. And the aim is basically then to try and match up other folk, and particularly through the SNP testing. So as you've seen with some of the families we've focused on in this presentation, we've been able to identify SNPs that are carried by particular branches of families. And so in some cases, you could say if you carry that SNP, you descend from, well, for example, David Dunbar of Durris that we mentioned, that type of thing.
Yeah, I would just add that there's the number of checks and balances in this process. We tend to test number of lines. So we get a documented descent, then we'd have to get another documented descent, and maybe even 3. And we try to get documented descents that connect as far back as possible. So not in the last few generations. We're talking like 500 years, 600 years. And this is to look out for breaks in the Y line because of illegitimacy or some other event. So we to confirm that we do have the signature of the progenitor, we have to be very thorough, and sometimes we might have one sample and we can work with that, but it's not necessarily enough, and we have to search out other documented descents, and that can take a little bit of time.
I could imagine. Paul has another question. How can you pinpoint where and when markers are created?
Yeah, so that comes down to the question of trying to identify the SNP progenitor, which I described towards the end of the talk there. So is looking for a descendants of 2 sons of a particular individual, 2 or more sons. If we find that the descendants of 2 or more sons of an individual carry that SNP, but there's also a need to test descendants of a brother of the individual as well, because if they don't carry the SNP, then we know it's formed in the first individual. It's a bit difficult to describe without looking at diagrams and things. Maybe we should go back to the slide. Can we put that one up? It's number 36.
I could just fly that up just now.
Yeah, that makes it a bit clearer. You could see on the diagram there. So you've got the red or pink coloured individual on this diagram.
Go back again.
Yeah, that's it there. So you see the pink individual, and then down from him you've got the 2 sons and then their descent. So if the descents from those 2 lines all carry the SNP, but then you'll see below the pink individual, you see the blue line, that's his brother, and they don't carry it, then we know that it can't have been inherited from the father of those two, who's the first individual on the left. So it must have been formed in the first pink individual. Don't know how clear that is. I'm trying to make it as clear as possible.
Yeah, so we need to test multiple lines to do this, and and that takes a considerable amount of work, but it's possible. And when you do, the other example that Graham did was the Stewarts of Bonkle.
Sir John Stewart.
Sir John, who's positive for 781, and then the other line doesn't have it. So I'll just stop sharing there. Okay.
So I'm just looking at some other questions here. So one question is this work unique to Scotland, or is there similar research going on maybe elsewhere in the UK, for example, looking at signatories of the Magna Carta perhaps, or the Treaty of Montgomery in Wales? Is there any sort of parallel project?
Not really, as far as we know. Not quite the same nature. I don't think. You don't know anything, Ali, either, do you?
No, I'm not aware of something very similar to this. There's lots of research going on to use the technology and the tests to help people extend their family tree. So what we're illustrating tonight, we're using noble lines, but the same principles and approach can be used for our own genealogy and that and other families. So it can help us to break through brick walls in our research. It's the same techniques. So yeah, it doesn't have to be famous people, but we're using famous people because they've got good documentary research. But if we've got documentary research back to 1650 or 1700, then we can still use the same type of approach to help us overcome gaps in the parish records. It allows us to identify what lineages are the same,
But probably to go back this distance in time, it's almost always going to be noble families because of the documentation. We never know. I mean, maybe eventually some example will come to the fore of somebody who's been recorded who's of lower status. I mean, there are folk recorded in medieval records other than the nobility. So maybe one day it would be nice to have such an example from really early period.
The thing is that though we're talking about all these noble folk, it doesn't take long for when we do our research, our own research, to find that we have connections to various surnames, and younger sons simply quite quickly dropped out of the higher echelons of society and ended up being cotters and so forth. And this is what is quite encouraging when folk who don't know how they're connected find that they can connect, like yourself, Neil, your son testing and getting connected to the Sutherlands, and then the history that is connected to that family becomes more personal. Although for many generations they've just been labourers and so forth, there's a way to connect into the lineages.
Yeah, there's quite an interesting example of that type in one of the articles that we did on this, which was the example of Julie McFarlane, who we discovered was actually a member of staff at Strathclyde at the time that this was discovered. And it turned out she matched an individual who'd been taking part in our Battle of Bannockburn family history project through autosomal DNA testing. Because there was obviously she was a female and her descent was proved from the Stuarts through several female links, but her she had an ancestor, I think it was either great-grandfather or great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, who was a miner killed in the Blantyre mining disaster, which was reckoned to be the largest mining disaster in Scotland. So you can see that the status there had gone right down to miners. but he was actually descended from King Robert II.
Val's got some follow-up questions here. Is it always the male line that forms the SNPs, or can it be influenced by the mother?
Oh, I don't think so.
It's always, because it's a Y chromosome, we're looking at specifically in this type of research we've shown tonight. Yeah, the mothers unfortunately don't have any input into the mutations, or it's very much directly down the male line. As we talked about a minute ago, Graham did, about the autosomal, that DNA is from both parents, and that's a completely different type of testing.
Yeah, but it can't take us back this distance in time. That's the problem. But as I say, you can get examples like that one I mentioned, where they might find they've matched somebody who is a male line descendant and can take a Y-DNA test, so that they can then prove, despite having some female links, they can prove that descent.
Thank you. What's next? So the introduction clearly showed that you're both extremely well qualified in your fields, and that this person's question is, was your knowledge gained through a university degree in this kind of subject, and how long has genealogy been part of a university offering? The person's saying that they hadn't appreciated that the subject might be degree level, assuming that it was that. I'm not sure if you're. I think the question is kind of saying, are you kind of self-taught, or was this a university degree course you had to do, and then it became a sort of university course in its own right?
Well, I think we've got two quite different stories there. Myself, I mean, I've been interested in family history since, well, I was still at primary school, in fact, when I started, so a very long time now, and the ways of accessing sources, of course, has changed enormously since then. But basically, I was a librarian for most of my career, and then eventually moved into genealogy education and helped to set up the course at Strathclyde University in Materia. So I wasn't trained as such, but actually helped to create the courses that are there now. But Ali's got a different story. You want to tell yours?
Well, like Graham, I was a little bit late. I was probably in my teens when I started getting interested in genealogy and family history, and I was the one, I was the youngest grandchild, and the one who wrote things down. My grandfather was still alive. He was really old, and because he was illegitimate, I wanted to find out about, and I used to go into New Register House and open old books and stuff way back in the 80s. And then I was in engineering for 28 years, straight from school, making bits for aircraft. But I was always, family history and genealogy was my passion. And then the course that Graham's described in 2007 was just starting. But Graham and Bruce Dury were involved in starting that at Strathclyde University. I was fortunate to get asked to, I enrolled, I was accepted, and so I was a part of the first cohort. When it was on campus on a Saturday, we used to go in on a Saturday for the lectures. And the next year, I started the diploma, and I was asked to do some tutoring for the year that was starting, and that's how I got involved in the course. So that was back in 2007, 2008. As far as the DNA, I tested around about 2004. I think my mother saw something in the Sunday Post about sending off a sample to the States, and you wouldn't. It was just to help science, and so I did that. And but eventually, a few years later, it came about. There was a website. The internet just started. There was a website you could actually go on, and because you submitted your genealogy at the same time as your sample, and by looking for your genealogy that you'd submitted, you could eventually find your DNA, and that's how I got my first profile. But then I tested my family tree DNA, and it's been self-taught. I got in that first year, I think I was probably the only one out of 20 who was interested in DNA, and most people were suspicious of it. And I just sort of learned and got involved in projects, and it's gone from there. And now there's so many research questions that you could explore once you get into it. And I think we're looking at one end, but there's an awful lot of other things that is very much on the ground level of research for folk who they're not wanting to find noble ancestors. They just want to overcome their brick walls, and that's where all the meat, a lot of meat is there, and opportunities to explore and overcome difficulties.
You mentioned a diploma, but is there an undergraduate, is there a degree level course in genealogy being run there then?
No, I was just going to make a point about the general issue on genealogy education. The major undergraduate degree is offered by Brigham Young University in the United States. We, as far as we know, are the only postgraduate level course specifically on genealogy. There was a course on family history and local history at Dundee University, but that's been discontinued meantime, but it wasn't purely genealogy. There are some other courses smaller courses at undergraduate level, maybe not full degree courses in other parts of the world. But our course is fairly unique as far as we know. And as Brigham Young University is the other major provider, and they have an undergraduate degree course there.
Yeah, so the program that Graham and I involved in, there's it's like 3 levels. So the certificate, diploma, and then the dissertation, so that you get a master's out at the end. But Graham and I also run 2 8-week courses on genetic genealogy that are standalone, and they're I don't know what you call it, Graham. Certificate? No, it's not. What's it called? Learning certificate. It's called.
Open studies.
Open studies. That's right.
Yeah, you can get.
And these are all online, and they're 8 weeks online course, so you can get a grounding in DNA testing and how it relates to family history.
I think that kind of leads into the next question. Let me just see this here. So, is University of Strathclyde then the leading centre for this type of research project in the UK?
Well, I would say so. As far as we're aware, that we're basically, as I said earlier, basically the only one doing this type of work, really. You want to say anything on that, Ali?
Yeah, I think because of our genealogical course masters, we've got quite a foundation in the traditional research. There are other universities are doing bits and pieces with DNA for sure. I mean, you look at Richard III at Leicester, and there's other universities using DNA, particularly for medical outcomes, and they might well report on some sort of genealogical or who the people were type of thing. But linking it to the traditional documentary, then I suppose we've got quite a profile. I'd hate to say we're the only people in the world type of thing. We're not. But I think. Yeah, I don't know.
Are you just being modest now?
I don't like blowing our own trumpet, but
what's next? So this person's saying, very interesting talk. Which one of your findings has given you, we'll start with the first one, they've broken it down, the most satisfaction?
That's a difficult one, isn't it? I suppose the major focus we've had has been on the Stuarts, and I suppose that really because there's been so many folk have tested, and it's been very successful in finding these lines from 3 of the sons of Robert II. So probably that. I mean, there are still gaps in that research. I mean, there's a notable other son, Alexander Stewart, Earl of Buchan, commonly known as the Wolf of Badenoch, and currently we're trying to hunt down his descendants and try and get some genetic genealogy results from that. And we think we're making a bit of progress at the moment, but that remains to be seen whether that works out. That would be very satisfying if we do have success there, I think. Yeah.
I think it's when you see a number of individuals who didn't know anything about their backgrounds, and then they suddenly find that they can actually link into the history books. I think that's a kick I love. Because I know from my own background, I've got no famous ancestors. I'm not looking for them, but it's just I can't even link into all these history books. But then when you start doing some genetic genealogy, you can find some linkage, and it just brings the history alive. That's I love making things personal.
Yeah.
And what's the biggest surprise been in the project so far, would you say?
Biggest surprise, maybe. Well, possibly that example I mentioned with the miner in the Blantyre mine disaster. That was a particularly interesting one, I think. Have you got anything you want to pick out, Ali? Difficult.
Yeah,
there's
a good question, isn't it?
so many things that have been good about it, really. And
sorry, when you go.
I was just going to say that, I mean, the main focus, the main thing we do hope to achieve really is to, as Ali said, to, allow people living today to discover these things, these unknown medieval ancestries.
Yeah, I think it's pushing the boundaries beyond just when the paper trail's beginning to get a bit bare, but there's other people still have paper trail, allowing us to just get back a little bit further. So, as I said earlier on, if our paper trail's beginning to run out in 1780s, but there's a few other lines that are going on, being able to piggyback but show beyond reasonable doubt that how the connection is, not people just, that looks about right. That's one of the things with genetic genealogy. We use it to corroborate, but also show that lines are or connections are what we think they are. So we sort of hypothesize and try to eliminate all the other possibilities, and genetic genealogy is very good for that. It's one of the things we try to teach our students, to always don't go for the most obvious, assemble all the information, all the possibilities, then seek to disprove them, seek to eliminate them. And DNA testing is very good at that. It's got DNA testing, it's got to be used very wisely, as we've mentioned about consent, about not jumping to conclusions, but when you interpret it wisely, it can be really quite powerful. And
so the third, so we've had what was the most satisfying? Just let me remind myself. We had the most satisfying, the biggest surprise. What about the biggest disappointment, if there has been one? That is.
Oh yeah. I think we've had plenty of them, haven't we, really? Because trying to trace down unbroken male lines from 700 years ago is very challenging. And, well, it's not just the tracing down of them. We then have to locate the people you've found, contact them, and hope that they'll agree to do a test, and that test will work out successfully. So there have been quite a number of disappointments. Well, there was a recent one that was quite disappointing, but I'm afraid because of confidentiality, I don't think I can really tell you what it was. There was a case that with the Stewarts that we were going to test somebody to see if a particular very interesting story was going to be proved to be correct, and it didn't work out successfully. It doesn't actually necessarily disprove the story, but to take it any further would involve a tremendous amount of work. So we've had to abandon that line of research meantime. But it would have been a really good story.
Yeah, we're mentioning about research into the disinherited. That's those who opposed Bruce and lost out and lost lands, and what happened to those individuals and families and so forth. And that's a whole area of further research. And one of the families is the MacDougals, who I've been doing research on. And one of the biggest surprises there is how few MacDougals there are who, through the genetics, are shown to be of the chiefly, what we'll call the chiefly line. And those type of revelations are really just show you the contrast on and what the outcome can be for families when they make a particular choice and when particular historical events can impact them. So for the MacDougals, losing number of important kin, head of kin at certain events, massacres and the Wars of the Covenants and so forth, has left them quite threadbare because a number of their lineages have dotted out. Basically, they failed to produce men. So it's like the three main lines today are all female descents. So yeah, it's quite sobering in some ways to see how, because a lot of lines are on the verge of dying out. That's normal.
And I suppose it was quite common back then for families to kind of change allegiance depending on who they thought were maybe going to be the victors, rather than who they necessarily agreed maybe politically with, or as a kind of principle, but they're just for the sake of safety and survival, I suppose.
Oh yeah.
I think families always hedged their bets when they could have that.
Okay, so the final question that I have here is, let me see. So as technology advances, is there any particular area of your work you would like to see significant advances in? Or is it just a kind of across the board?
Well, I was going to say about the ancient DNA, Graham, the advances in that area. The technologies, we've shown a little bit of what it can reveal as far as discovering markers, but the technologies are now allowing ancient DNA. So archaeologists now use it routinely when they find remains, and they're using whole genome and different types of sequencing to get data from the remains. So that is, we're starting in the present day. So, but they're starting at a point in time. They can use carbon dating and isotope testing and so forth to establish a date of remains. And then when they get DNA out of it, that gives a baseline for us. And so there are now dozens and dozens of ancient DNA samples becoming available, and we can connect with them. If people do big Y testing, it gives enough data to, and if it's comparable to what's been done by the archaeologist folk, we can meet halfway, and that's really beginning to help us see the connections of lineages and the population of Scotland, for instance. That's quite an exciting area, I think.
Right. The one I was thinking of was, which I've been keeping a close eye on recently, is some work on sequencing of the human genome. Just to explain that briefly, the Human Genome Project, which probably many of you have heard of, supposedly completed its work in, I think it was 2003. But in fact, there were still considerable gaps in the sequenced at that point of the human genome. And over the last couple of years or so, very high level work has been done by geneticists, particularly in the United States, but other parts of the world as well, working together to produce a more complete sequence. And it's particularly exciting from the point of view of Y-DNA, because the autosomal DNA, 22 autosomes, I think this group reckon they increased the amount being able to be read by about 10%. But the Y chromosome is a particularly challenging one, with lots of areas that have been unreadable and repeating areas in the chromosome. And as far as I remember, currently there's only roughly about 40% read. So there's potentially a huge increase that can be achieved by the work of this group. They've just very recently completed doing the Y chromosome. So that's an area that I'm keeping a close eye on, and hope it might filter down to benefit genetic genealogy maybe in a year or two's time. We'll have to wait and see.
Okay, well, with no other questions, I'll just say thank you to both of you, to Graham and to Alasdair, and I'll end the broadcast and just wish everyone a good evening, and hopefully you can join us for the December talk. But for now, I'll say good evening to everybody, and thanks again, guys. Just hang fire, and I'll have a wee chat with you after I finish the broadcast.
Right. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Right.